Kitty Kelley's unauthorized biography of Nancy Reagan has sent shockwaves across the country. Among the things the book claims is that Nancy was the president during her husband's second term, that Nancy had an affair with Frank Sinatra, and that Ronald Reagan date-raped a young starlet while he was an actor in Hollywood. And there's much more, as you know, if you've read the book or read the reviews. Kitty Kelley is here with an inside look at the Reagan White House and the controversy surrounding her book. Good morning, Kitty.
Hi,
I know you're not
Eileen.
feeling well.
And got hit with some bronchitis.
Bronchitis.
I'm afraid.
Oh boy. Well, we've got water here for you. So you canceled your tour. We were expecting you actually a couple weeks ago, and we heard there was some death threats.
I apologize to you about that. It was the first week of publication, which was April 8th, and about the fourth day, I did get some calls, and some principals at Simon & Schuster did too, so we had to pull back for a couple of days, and they felt that they had... You know, when you report these to the authorities and they come in, they say you're not supposed to talk about them because you bring every loon out of the landscape.
Yeah.
But they were to be taken seriously because there was a name to them, and they weren't just, you know, your normal anonymous telephone calls.
So why are you out now? I mean, one would presume that you would just pull back for a longer time.
Well, I'm traveling with
You have a bodyguard?
No, I'm just kidding you. They really readdressed the security thing, and I think it's taken care of now, and nobody is as worried.
Is concerned. Did you expect this kind of furor over the book?
Well, I knew that there would be a certain amount of controversy because it's a book about a controversial woman, written by a controversial author, and it is unauthorized, which means she had no editorial say. But I didn't expect the absolute hoo-ha. You know, this is a book about power and hypocrisy, but now the hypocrisy's on the other side almost with the... I've outraged the emperor by standing forward and saying the emperor has no clothes. I've outraged the people around the emperor and some of the people in the press corps who've been saying that the emperor was royally dressed for 8 years.
A Time magazine article. The editor of Time said, in People magazine, I believe, that there really was, you know, there was no connection. I mean, did the Time magazine stand up for Nancy Reagan, in your opinion?
Yeah, so I think so. And as a matter of fact, the former bureau chief of Time magazine went on national television. His name is in the acknowledgments, and I'm thanking him. He said, I don't know why I'm in there. I mean, everybody's running for cover. And I wrote to him, and I said, Dear Strobe, you were bureau chief at the time. You opened your bureau to my researcher. You provided Xeroxing facilities, library facilities. I was grateful then, and I'm grateful now. That's why your name was in. You know, as accustomed as I am to being attacked, I feel like I've hit a new low in being criticized for good manners.
It's interesting that when you wrote the Sinatra book, you expected the world to come caving down on you because of his power. It didn't happen.
Well, it did. I mean, he sued before I had written. If you had asked me...
You didn't have death threats.
No. But if you'd asked me maybe 5 years ago, the hardest thing I would ever do in my professional career, I would have said it was to write the Frank Sinatra book because people were so terrified. They thought they were going to lose their lives if they talked to me, and especially if they talked on the record. Terrified of physical violence. I thought, I will never do anything in my life that hard again. This was 20 times worse. She's far more powerful than Sinatra, but it's an insidious kind of power. It isn't, you'd almost rather be beat up physically than get beat up psychologically. First year, people said, no, I won't talk to you. I'll have my taxes audited. My husband or wife will lose their job. I'll be kicked off a corporate board. I'll be discredited in some way. Eileen, I thought they were paranoid until, about a year into it, I got a call from the FBI myself. And my researcher had filed Freedom of Information requests. And we were looking into Mrs. Reagan's mother's undercover police activities.
Edith Davis.
Edith Davis. And she was dead at the time. And we filed these requests. Melissa did. I got the call from the FBI saying, are these requests for your book? And I said, yes. I wasn't going to lie at all. And he said, we just wanted to make very sure that... I said, this is an unusual call because they never call you. The requests were turned down, and the 2 administrative appeals were denied.
You combined Sinatra and Nancy Reagan in your book, and it's well publicized. Do you ever say they had an affair?
Do I ever say there was sex? No, but here's, you know, the people who haven't read the book, and they just read the press cuttings, think that it goes into great and graphic detail. It doesn't. It is laid out. Mrs. Reagan, her public infatuation with Sinatra was known. It was known for a long, long time.
But it's so fascinating to read this book because early on you write that Frank would walk out of a party, thought Ronnie was a bore if Ronnie and Nancy were there. He couldn't stand Nancy Reagan either. He said she was a dope with fat ankles who could never make it as an actress. That was early on, and yet then you write or intimate that there was a lot more going on.
It's true. Sinatra was a liberal Democrat during those Hollywood days, hated Reagan. He used to go like this. He'd snap his fingers to Jimmy Van Heusen and say, "Get me out of here when that guy comes." He said, "I'll leave California if he's ever elected."
What turned it around?
Frank Sinatra was kicked out of the Kennedy White House for his organized crime ties. And when Ronald Reagan was running against a Kennedy man, Jess Unruh, for the second gubernatorial race, Sinatra came out for Reagan, proving, what is that old Sicilian thing? The enemy of thy enemy becomes thy friend. And he embraced the Reagans. Mrs. Reagan was entranced, and the only thing that gives you indication that there was people around the president and the first lady worried about the relationship with Frank Sinatra. And in the 70s, in that second term, Mrs. Reagan flew to Chicago ostensibly to see her parents, but she spent the time with Sinatra in his hotel. What they did, I don't know. The book doesn't speculate. What they did during their private lunches in the White House.
But the staffers say that all of her lunches were private. She very often said private lunch on her calendar, no calls when she had someone she admired or who was special to her.
Eileen, not the lunches with Frank Sinatra. I have Mrs. Reagan's calendars. I have her official and her private calendars, which were given to me by members of her staff. He was never on the schedule, ever. A lot of members of her staff didn't even know when he was coming. Only 2 or 3 people knew. He was brought up the back way. All calls were held. No.
You have a picture in the book of Sinatra and Nancy dancing and Ronnie trying to break up that dance. Now, you put it in the book. You don't say much except that Ronnie's trying to break in, but a staffer said, wait a minute, that was a posed photo. We thought it'd be a cute photo opportunity.
Who said that? That's a...
White House staffer.
Oh, well, there you go. This was at the president's 70th birthday in February of 1981. The book goes into great detail about what happened with this picture. The picture wasn't going to become available until 3 a.m. Mrs. Reagan had control over all photographs in the White House, but nobody wanted her awakened at that time. Jim Baker didn't want to be awakened, and neither did Mike Deaver. So Michael Evans, the top White House photographer, released that photograph because he said it was the best one. Hardly staged. Hardly staged.
All right.
And then, when it was released, Mike Deaver gave him such problems.
You say that Nancy Reagan was not a great actress and that she slept with people to further her career. One of them was the head of MGM, Benny Thaw?
Benny Thaw.
Benny Thaw.
T-H-A-U.
Yeah. Who told you that?
Oh, this was very well known Benny Thaw has admitted it, the head of drama at MGM. The producers and the directors, Gottfried Reinhardt in the book says he had to cast Nancy Reagan because of this relationship. Now, she was not alone in this. There were a lot of starlets who were very, very ambitious and did the same thing to pursue their career. Also,
you claim that Ronnie did some things with some starlets that weren't exactly right, like the date rape of one. Talk about that woman. And then we have to go to break and continue this.
I beg your pardon. It was a woman by the name of Celine Waters, and she described it as date rape. I didn't. She told me that she had gone out with him, and interestingly enough, it was during his courtship with Nancy Reagan, and Miss Waters wanted to be seen with him. She was very open about that.
And yet People magazine quotes her as saying, no, I never called it date rape. We didn't call it date rape in those days.
Well, she did. I have her on tape. All interviews were done on tape. I have over 1,000 of them.
Is it interesting that she's trying to get a book published? Does that in any way make her a suspect in this story?
Well, if you use that as your criterion, then you'd never interview a politician. You'd never interview an entertainer. They all want to get a book published. Absolutely. You wouldn't. Look at Patti Davis is working on her 3rd book now. Michael Reagan wrote a book. Maureen Reagan. You could never interview anybody. I don't think that, because they want a book published. She didn't at the time. Now she does.
All right, let's take a break. We'll come back. We'll talk about Jacqueline Park. We'll talk about Patti, Maureen, Michael, and many other things that Kitty writes about. We'll be right back. Reagan's women early on. Jacqueline Park is a psychodramatist in New York. This is a woman who acts out men's fantasies. As a starlet, she claimed that Ronnie got her pregnant and then wouldn't marry her.
That's right.
You talked with her.
Yes. Interestingly enough, I had talked with her on the Sinatra book because she was the longtime mistress of Jack Warner. And she went into a rambling recitation of her life, and she went on and on about Ronald Reagan and Jack Warner. I wasn't interested in them. I just wanted to hear about Frank Sinatra. But after I started writing about Reagan, I called her back again. I said, now, what was it you told me about Ronald Reagan?
Who was the other woman, the woman that actually said, Doris Lilly?
With the letters, the love letters.
She said he was very sweet and very quiet and very nice, Ronnie
well,
Reagan.
She said in her interviews with me, and I had 2 or 3 with her, she also sold their love letters, you know.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, during his administration, he had written her letters, and she put them up for auction, and they were auctioned off, and she was very angry because Malcolm Forbes bought the letters, and he bought them to give to Nancy, and Doris Lilly knew that Nancy would destroy the letters, and she felt that they were really of historical value.
How did Nancy, you write that Nancy really forced Ronnie into marrying her.
Well, I mean, this is part of the book where you have real sympathy for her, I think. I mean, she fell in love with this man the first time she met him, and he wasn't in love with her, and he was seeing other women. He had been devastated by the Jane Wyman divorce. He was in love with a woman by the name of Christine Larson, who was a blonde actress, and he had asked her to marry him, but she turned him down because she was very a devout Baha'i, which is a religion that I've been told does not embrace politics. And at that time, he was president of the Screen Actors Guild. So she turned him down, but she kept the diamond wristwatch. In any event, he continued that affair into his marriage with Nancy. They got married when Nancy became pregnant, and Reagan continued seeing Christine Larson up and including the night that his daughter was born. Then after that, he really kind of consecrated himself to marriage.
In fact, who did he tell, if you really want to keep a marriage and make it good, never have an affair on your wife?
That's right.
He told somebody that.
He wrote that letter to his son, Michael.
Did he?
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of Michael, Michael and Maureen came from the Wyman marriage, and as young children, you write, they were really shunned by Nancy.
Oh, yeah. They were.
Not early on. Early on, she really wooed them and was kind to them, and they loved being with her. Once they got married, Nancy and Ronnie, though, you say.
Yeah, she closed the door. That is the toughest part of the book, I think. And the hardest part to write is the profile about the Reagans' children.
Why?
Well, because Ronald and Nancy Reagan are the most public figures in America. There's some people that say, oh, you have no right to violate their privacy. Well, you have to in order to write this kind of a book. But they were the president and the first lady, and they're public figures. Their children are also public figures, but by virtue only of being the Reagans' kids. Yeah, and that was, even though they put themselves out there, and they've, especially Maureen and Michael, and they've written books, and they go on the air all the time, it was very hard to write that stuff.
Patti Davis took her mother's name because she didn't want anything to do with the Reagan family. She also says that you write that she had an abortion. She says, look, I would say if I had an abortion. I mean, I'm the kind of person that would come out and say it. I didn't have one.
She also says that she understands why Kitty Kelley wrote that this is the story that her mother has been telling for many, many years to her closest friends and her top aides. And Patti admits very freely that she went off to have a tubal ligation because she could not stand the thought of passing on her mother's genes. I mean, that just tells you the hatred.
Why? When did this whole thing fall apart with Patti and Nancy?
It started early. Eileen, it started when she was born, really. I mean, Mrs. Reagan resented her. And when she was 2 years old, Mrs. Reagan herself writes about it in her own book, how Patti would hold the peas in her mouth and not swallow them.
Very stubborn child.
And Nancy would just get so enraged. I mean, she was 2 years old.
Ron Jr. was the love of her life?
Yes, I mean, Ron Jr. is obviously the favorite child, and it shows. I mean, he's the one that is most, he's got the best sense of humor. He's, you know.
But she wanted a boy. She desperately wanted a boy. Did that make a difference?
Because Jane Wyman, she felt, was unable to give a male child to Ronald Reagan, and this is something that Nancy
But he
wanted
gave Michael. Or she gave Michael. Wasn't Michael Jane Wyman's child?
He was an adopted son, and that's
sorry.
why Nancy felt that to give a boy child. And she went to her astrologers. I mean, Mrs. Reagan has been into astrologers from the very first she came to Hollywood. And interestingly enough, I mean, the astrologer's business is all laid out in the book. And Ronald Reagan had his own astrologer in the White House in addition to Mrs. Reagan's astrologer. I don't happen to be a believer in this, but I laid out every bit of it. I researched every bit of it, and I have to tell you honestly that the advice that the astrologers gave was really very benign. I mean, we should be very thankful.
What do you mean, very benign? Had it been more overt advice?
Well, I mean, it could have been really Looney Tunes. It could have been, you know, when Ed Heelan, the president's astrologer, I said, what did you advise the president on? He said, well, the president would call me from Camp David, and he would ask me about how to position the PR effects of the bombing of Libya or the invasion of Grenada. And I'm sitting there on the telephone thinking, I don't believe this, that the President of the United States is asking an astrologer. And I said, well, what would you tell him? And he said, well, I have his computerized chart here, and we go over it and see that this was what he should do then, and he should say this. All very benign, most of it dealing with timing, what you should say on Wednesday and don't say it on Thursday. Don't go this. But nevertheless, it was benign.
Talk about, early in the book, you really go back to Nancy Reagan's background with her mother, Edith Davis, who you claim was the master manipulator. You say Nancy learned it from the master.
That's right.
She loved vulgarity, and you claim she loved dirty jokes. Ronnie loved that about her. And Nancy's own father, in this case, Ron, what was her father's name?
Ken Robbins.
Ken Robbins. Talk about a little bit about the background of Nancy Reagan as a kid.
Well, it's a fascinating story because she really has recreated herself. Her mother was a traveling actress, and she was an actress at a time that when they had signs up in hotels that said no actors, no dogs. So it was considered a very déclassé profession. But Mrs. Davis, Edith Luckett as she was known, after she had Nancy, she got tired of being married and being a mother. And so she deposited Nancy with her sister and brother-in-law in Bethesda, Maryland for several years, and she went back on the road. She got divorced. When she got to Chicago, maybe 5 or 6 years later, she met this impoverished doctor, Loyal Davis. They got married. And that's when she brought Nancy to Chicago, and Nancy began living with her mother and her stepfather.
She idolized Dr. Davis, Nancy
She did indeed.
Wanted his name desperately, wanted him to adopt her desperately.
That's right, and he didn't want to. He didn't want to, mostly he didn't want to because her natural father was still alive, and he wanted her to maintain that contact with her natural father. She did not want to. And so by the time she was 17, and Dr. Davis had turned her down at the age of 14 when it's legal, 15, 16. Finally at 17 she went to a lawyer in the apartment building and said, what do I do? And he told her the procedure. She got the papers, she went to New York, she presented them to her natural father, and she said, I don't want to be your daughter, I want to be adopted by Loyal Davis. And he signed the papers.
You write something that sounds like it hurt her grandmother very deeply. Her biological grandmother, who was very kind to her, Nanny.
Nanny Robbins, yeah, she really...
Was ignored at the end?
Yeah, she was. When she died, her cousins, Nancy's cousins, told me that they had contacted Nancy because Nanny had been so good to her as a little girl, sort of taken over her mother's role, which is something her mother did for Nancy's children. She became the surrogate mother for Patti and Michael. When Nanny Robbins died, the cousins called Nancy because they had no money and they wanted to get a headstone. And Nancy said she didn't have the money, and yet they pointed out that...
So there was no headstone in Nanny's grave, huh?
To this day.
It's also interesting that a woman who was kind of abandoned by her mother and didn't get an opportunity to live with her biological father would have kind of shunned Maureen and Michael. It's an interesting thing to think. Oh, if it's true, this woman as a young girl knew loneliness.
Yes.
And yet, Maureen and Michael have both written that that happened to them.
That's right. It is interesting. I mean, I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, so it's hard to try and interpret that clinically, but perhaps because she never had the nurturing. You cannot replace a mother's love. You simply cannot. No matter what you do as you grow up, it shows. And she didn't have a mother for a long time, so it's probably hard for her in turn to be one.
Conversation. You say that Nancy was the president, not Ronnie, especially during the second term.
Well, he was president, too. I don't mean to be too flippant, Eileen, but she really was. First of all, he would never have been in the White House had it not been for Nancy Reagan. And this is probably...
Why? Let me stop you. Why?
the drive, the ambition. I mean, she pushed him in '68. She pushed him in 1976.
Is that bad?
No, I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just pointing out this is the drive behind this man. In fact, in '76, he really didn't want to go. She went to her astrologer. In fact, she shopped astrologers to find someone who would say, it's the right time, go for it. Again in '80, she wanted that very, very much. So she is the one who propelled it. And the children, I think, would admit that. Reagan, too, is ambitious. I don't mean to say that he's a totally passive, aloof man, but without Nancy Reagan, he would not have been in the White House. And with her there, I think we should be very thankful. I mean, I am. I think that was really her greatest role.
Why? Is it because you intimate that during the second presidency, he was mentally not as sharp as the... it's not exactly what you say.
Well, let's put it this way. Nancy Reagan was the first one to see that Ronald Reagan was closed for repairs. She knew it. So she became very, very protective. She would coach him. She made sure that he had 3x5 cards in front of him. She made his aides give him talking points. She made sure that there were masking tape marks so that he'd know where to stand, how to pose for pictures. She controlled the photographic history of the White House, with the exception of that one photograph that you talked about earlier.
It keeps rattling in my brain, so let me ask it now. You said that after the assassination attempt that it was so painful for Nancy to see Jim Brady. It was such a reminder of that she never invited them to the White House.
Well, she did invite him later. She did invite him later.
Because Sarah Brady, Jim's wife, said, not true, she was there for us. We were invited, she was caring and compassionate, and it's
She was
just
in the hospital, but she didn't invite him until about 1986. It was very, very hard for her. In fact, she could not say assassination attempt. She would say that thing that happened to Ronnie. That's how she dealt with it.
But what about the people who are saying, wait a minute, like Sarah Brady?
There are a lot of people who are running for cover on this book, a lot of people, and they're saying, didn't happen, wasn't true. I promise you, it was true. The book is documented. You can't blame these people. I mean, right now, especially the Bradys. The Reagans have finally come out for the Brady bill. He could have done it when he was in the White House, but he waited until after he was out of the White House. That, too, was Mrs. Reagan's doing. She's the one who insisted in the last month that the president step forward, the former president step forward and declare himself. So, of course, the Bradys are great people. Of course, they're going to say that. Mrs. Bush, same thing. She hasn't read the book, but she said, please.
Oh, please what?
Trash fiction, trash fiction. You know, I applaud Barbara Bush for that. I mean, she's being very gracious. She's demonstrating good manners to her predecessor.
What do you know about the relationship between Nancy and Barbara?
They hate each other. Nancy Reagan can't stand Barbara Bush, has always despised George Bush, did not want him to be vice president, and never once in 8 years did the Reagans ever invite the Bushes for dinner, ever, even after the Bushes invited them. Yes, they were included in White House state dinners because they had to be. He was vice president of the United States.
Who told you this?
Eileen, your question should be how many people told you this?
How many people?
Try the social secretaries, the people around the president, the White House secretaries. This was well known.
Let's take a call. Good morning. You're on Good Day.
Good morning, Eileen.
How are
is
you?
Linda from Medfield.
Go ahead, Linda.
I read Kitty Kelley's book, and I enjoyed it very much. I thought it was a very thought-provoking look at an American myth. But this is my question for Kitty Kelley. How did she feel? She's been treated by the press. I saw Sam Donaldson's interview with her on Primetime Live, and I thought she handled herself like such a lady. And I've never seen him go after Ronald Reagan quite like that. I wanted to know what her thoughts were on that.
Well, you want to share what you told me when we sat down here? What did he say to you right before the interview?
Oh, before the interview, Kitty, the book is brilliant. Everybody knows it. You're right on. It's really terrific. And so I got kind of...
Comfortable?
I'm so stupid. And I thought, oh, great. Everybody's attacking me. So then we get on camera. Boom! Now, after that show, his producer called and said, gee, Sam's really worried that Kitty hates him. And so he'd like to send her flowers. And I told my assistant, we'll just call back and say, I don't hate him, but I really don't want the flowers.
Were you really upset when that was over?
No, well, I was stunned. And I think, is it Linda who just called? I think her point's well taken. I expected to take hits from the people around the Reagans. I expect people to stand up and say, I didn't say it, not true, because that's what politicians do. And so many of the people I interviewed are still in political life.
Some have gone on record. Adolfo, that company, the president of that company has gone on record?
The former vice president.
Former vice president. With his name
With his name, I was stunned, saying that Mrs. Reagan, for 8 years in the White House, took almost $1 million in free goods, free suits, free purses,
Were
free
they
dresses.
reported as they are supposed to be?
No, they were not reported as they were supposed to be.
Let's take another call. Good morning.
Hi,
Hi.
this is Ann from Arlington.
Go ahead, Ann.
I would like to know how could Kelley, in all her mind and writing books and all, how could she ever think that Frank Sinatra would go to bed with Nancy Kelley?
Nancy,
After all
you mean
the
Nancy
stars
Reagan? Yeah.
Of Hollywood, his lovely wife, Barbara, how she would ever think that Frank Sinatra would go to bed
That
with
is so
Nancy
funny.
Reagan. Number one, I do not believe in her book. I haven't purchased her book. However, I will purchase the one they're writing about Kitty Kelley.
Oh, that's an interesting thing. I was going to ask Kitty about that.
Yeah, they are writing one about her, and that's the one I
Yeah.
would purchase. She does, you could see her right now on TV, smiling with that vicious smile of hers,
I'm sorry, she thinks it's vicious.
enjoying what she's writing, but it's all false. Most of it's false. 99% of the people in America do not believe in her book.
All right, you bring
And-
up a good. Go ahead.
Actually, the people who are buying the book believe in it. And one reason they can believe in it is because of the 57 pages of chapter notes in the back of the book. Few commercial biographies are this well documented. They know where the information is coming from. Now, to answer the first part of her question about Frank Sinatra and Nancy Reagan, it flies in the face of the public image of Nancy Reagan, of this prim, prissy, cold woman. Of course, it flies in the face. The entire book does. What it does really is rip a mask off of a public image, which is what gets people so crazy. The second part of her question was regarding a book that's being written
George
about me.
Carposi from Star is writing the unauthorized biography of Kitty Kelley, Poison Pen.
Poison pen.
What do you think of that?
Let me tell you, if he had to follow the standards of documentation that I have to follow in this, if it had to be as thoroughly lawyered and as truthful as mine had to be, it would be very boring. It won't be, so I hope he sells it to
Lines
them.
are open. I was just asking Kitty, early on in the book, you talk about Nancy running down Lakeshore Drive as a young woman, running up to two men and kissing them, full on the lips. You say, Ben and I were walking, this is a quote.
This is a quote.
Ben and I were walking down East Lakeshore Drive by the Drake Hotel. We just finished lunch when we saw Nancy, who came running over to us. She said she was leaving town, just wanted to say goodbye. She grabbed me first, kissed me hard on the lips, plunged her tongue down my throat. Then she thrust herself at Ben, who did the same thing. Bye-bye, tra-la-la, off she skipped. You never say who these men are.
That one I couldn't say.
Why?
Ben is now dead, and that man lives in Chicago and simply didn't want to be quoted by name.
Well known?
No, he's not well known. But you know, this is highly documented, this book. There are many people on the record, but there's some people who aren't, like
How do you
Secret
deal with
Service.
it, though, as an author, Kitty, if somebody tells you something and then later says, I never said it?
All right, here's
Then
what you
how
do.
can you call it real well documented when that happens?
Well, if a doctor, for instance, I've interviewed the Reagan's doctors, and doctors at Bethesda Naval who took out the Reagan's charts for me, they really ran a risk by doing that, and I can't quote them by name. Now, I don't think that they would step forward and say, no, I didn't say it, but you assume that people are going to say that. I mean, you just assume in doing that kind of thing when you're dealing with people who are frightened, and these are very powerful people I'm writing about.
Jack, some have said the way you obtained information was not altogether right. Michael Reagan has said, wait, Kitty lifted right from my book.
Oh, well, let me tell you why we did. Oh, Michael Reagan, he's so pathetic. My West Coast researcher, I have a full-time researcher in Washington, and I had a woman on the West Coast who did a lot of the West Coast interviewing for me. She called Michael Reagan. She had an interview on the telephone, 2 interviews, as a matter of fact. And she began asking him questions during the second interview that he said he had already answered. He said, take it from my book. You have permission to quote from my book. She said, thank you very much. We wrote him a letter. We thanked him for the interviews. We said we would take information from his book. We appreciated the permission. We did take some.
How about
We
Patti? Patti Davis said, wait a minute, the person that came to see me did not tell me this was for Kitty Kelley's book.
Well, they did, both of them, and they're on tape as doing so.
You have a tape of that, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think this will ever go to court? Do you think
No.
you'll ever be sued?
Wait, anybody can sue anybody. You can, I mean, I could sue you today, and you could sue me today. Are you going to win? No. Will they win on this book? Never. And
Nancy
the reason-
Reagan, we'll get to Frank Sinatra, but Nancy Reagan has not even commented on this.
No, but she's got an orchestrated campaign going now because there are letters coming into the publisher from people saying, I don't know why my name's in that book. I never did anything. I never talked to her. And then at the bottom says CC : Nancy Reagan.
Okay, how about the answer to Frank Sinatra? What has he said about the book?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I haven't been there, but I've read that he said that he hoped, I think it was in his show in Arizona, that he hoped I was standing on a corner and would be run over by 4 blind men. But the President of the United States and the First Lady have no privacy. Once they seek that office, they give it up. Their tax returns are public. Their intestines are diagnosed on national television. They absolutely have no privacy.
Some critics have said, wait a minute, this book isn't balanced. There's nothing nice about these two people in this book. Even when early on there is a contribution to the USO during the war, you make it sound like it's a manipulative move to social climb Chicago. You know what I mean? Nancy Reagan doesn't give as an alumni to Smith College. Well, I've never given a check to my college. You know, isn't that awful? But I never have. Not I'm a bad person, I'm just not a good alumni.
But you know what? That's not said. Okay, does that say anything negative? It is stating a fact. The people who say this book isn't balanced, I don't think have really read it.
Is there anything nice to say about Nancy Reagan?
And the best thing you can say about her is that she was a very, very good president, and we should be very thankful that she was there. Without her, we wouldn't have had a dialogue with Russia. Without her, we wouldn't have had moderating influence on Ronald Reagan. He was very doctrinaire about certain things, and she kept it at a minimum. Who was there?
Yeah. Who's this person, though? I mean, I guess I want to get to that, the people that secondhand information.
It's not secondhand, Eileen. Many of the people that I interviewed, I mean, they weren't forthcoming. It wasn't that my phone was ringing off the hook with people saying, I want to tell you this, I want to tell you that. And I'll tell you something. People do not come out with negative information. They really don't.
How about the hairdresser who you claim Nancy got all of her hairdressing for free, and yet in one of the publications there are the bills that say she paid? In fact, she asked that one be deleted. I think she was in Austria or somewhere. It was a bookkeeping error.
I think that was one bill, and that was the Washington hairdresser. It wasn't the hairdressers who have worked for her for many, many years. The point of that being that Mrs. Reagan is really accustomed to taking quite a bit for free. And she got that way when she was the governor's wife, and she felt really that it was her due. And she felt that people who gave her free dresses would get the publicity because she would be seen in public wearing them. And she felt it was really a business
haven't a lot of first ladies done that? Received gifts from other countries and from people?
Oh, absolutely, but we have laws in this country now.
So you're claiming that Nancy broke the law by not claiming these things, is that?
Exactly. I mean,